Well, this is probably the most different James Bond book of them all. And the main reason for that is said within this little foreword that is part of the book. The basic idea, according to Ian, is that somebody gave him a manuscript, which was a James Bond fan fiction, where instead, a mysterious woman known as Vivian Michelle wrote herself into a story to be rescued by the title character James Bond. And probably the other thing I find interesting as well is, in addition to that forward, you also get a little bit of an illustration as to where the main setting of the book takes place. So as I mentioned, this book is about a character named Vivian Michelle. Basically, we start out with seeing her in a cheap motel, waiting for the next day when everybody can pack up the furniture, lock everything up, and then she could be on her merry way onto her next destination. As she is sitting there, listening to the radio, the songs make her reminisce about her past. She originally grew up in Canada, where she kind of created a bit of a theological schism. So I guess every other girl in her family ended up going into the nunnery or getting married. She didn't want either of these, and thus was sent over to England at the age of 15 to finish her education. In England, she got on with a roommate, and she shared the rent with her. Now, there was one such time that there was a big party going on. There was a lot of alcohol, there was a lot of crazy stuff, and all kinds of guests were coming in from all over the place. And that is where she met a very mysterious man named Derek. Derek is her first love, and for a while it seemed like the relationship was going nicely, but then on the night that he was to go to college and they'd be separated, he was annoyed because he wanted to shag her before he went to college. She obviously was not too keen on the idea, but just kind of gave in out of a fear of being separated by him. At first they attempt to do it in the back of a movie theater, but after enough noise they are quickly kicked out, and so they do it inside of a clearing out in the middle of nowhere. Apparently it was a pretty popular spot, as there's like Coca-Cola bottles and cigarettes as well as like used prophylactics laying around. And it doesn't seem like it was described as a very pleasant experience. She's just like, well, I lost my virginity. That's it. It was just painful. I didn't enjoy it at all. Well, he enjoyed it immensely. He went to college and, well, about a month later, he got a letter saying, yeah, I found somebody else and I'm going to marry her instead. So there, she decided to get into the newspaper business. And she was making a pretty good stand in that business. In fact, even making it up to, like, Vice editor. But she didn't want to have her job be the only thing she had in her life. So she wanted to try to date somebody else. And she did. At first, this other man, he was a German fellow, was engaged to be with somebody else. They were good friends to begin with. Unfortunately, the bride-to-be broke up with him, and then they ended up getting together. All along the way, he shared what his Kama Sutra was. They enjoyed each other's love for a while when Vivian becomes pregnant. Well, Vivian was hoping that he would be joyed by the prospect and maybe even marry her. He just kind of went, I'm not dealing with this. Here, I brought some emergency funds. Go to Zurich, tell them you have this condition, and they can get rid of that baby for you. And, she's annoyed, but at the same time, she didn't want to be stuck with a child that neither of them wanted, so she went up to Zurich, she got the baby out of her, and from there, she basically just kind of wanted to start life all over again. So she went back to Canada to see her parents, And it's interesting that enough time has passed that nobody really cares about the whole theological schism that she was a part of. Her caretakers are not really on board with this idea that she's just going to basically buy a Vespa and travel around the United States. But she's headstrong, and she is not to be easily swayed by other people. So she worked her way on down from Canada and made it into New York, part of the Adirondack Park. It was the off season, and she decided to stay at a cheap motel. It just seemed like it was only going to be for a day or two, but not only did she catch the eye of the rather grabby Mr. Fancy, which was the owner of the hotel, but also the wife, Mrs. Fancy. And together they said, hey, perhaps you could stay a few days, we'll pay you, and then once everything is said and done, we'll lock up the place and then we'll pay you for it. Everything seemed to go well up until the last day that the Fancies would be around. At that point, she was basically treated like a tissue, like her purpose was used. It's just like, yeah, you'll get your money when the big boss comes by to shut down the place in the morning. And Vivian's just like, well, this seems a little weird. Now, as these flashbacks are happening, there is a furious thunderstorm going on, and Vivian starts to feel very much like a child, very much alone and frightened of this awful weather. So on a whim, she decides to hit the vacancy sign. But as she does so, the lightning struck the wire and she's out cold for several minutes. When she comes to, she realizes she's back in the lobby, and the music that was on the radio starts to play again. After that little tumble, she decides to freshen up and then just wait in the lobby, having a cigarette, maybe a little bit of alcohol, when all of a sudden there's a mysterious knock at the door. She opens it to find two very mysterious gentlemen wearing dark hoods. They say that they are from the amalgamation that owns the hotel, and they are there to help keep her company. Well, she lets them in, only to find out that she has fallen for one of the classic phishing scandals. You name drop a name, you say you're from there, and it turns out that these were just a whole bunch of hoodlums. Basically, they do a lot of unpleasant things to her. Not only do they throw her around a fair bit, but they force her to cook. She attempts to fight back, even trying to take an ice pick to one of their faces. She even tries to run away, but to no avail. Just when everything seemed bleak, there is one more knock at the door. It is a guest that saw the vacancy sign, and wouldn't you know that it was James Bond himself. At first, Vivian is frightened, thinking that it's just another gangster that's going to try to rape her in a few more minutes. But after some very quick signaling, James Bond catches on that this is a woman in distress. And so, he is able to keep the peace between him and the two gangsters that showed up. By the way, their names are Slugsy and Horror, which this is about the only connection that this book has to the movie. So, we got Slugsy, a short, rather stocky kind of person that has absolutely no hair on his body. And you got a tall, thin man who had very cheap dental done to him, so as such, most of his teeth are more pieces of metal than anything else. Make you think of Jaws and Sandur? But anyway, getting back into the book interpretation, Bond briefly describes what in the world he was doing out in this horrible weather. It turns out that he was a part of an assignment to be able to rescue a Russian defector that had fled to Canada. It turns out that an arm inspector realized that he was there, and so Bond, as well as the Mounties, had to find a way to be able to protect him as well as take care of their assassins. The job goes along easily enough. However, Bond still has to report to Washington by the end of it. He figures he might as well take his time, and he's just going to take a slow, leisurely drive down there. After all, they gave him 3 days to do it, and being in a nice sporty Thunderbird, I'm sure he could make up the time. But just before he hit the hotel, he got a flat tire, and so he wanted to go there for the night. After the explanation comes by, the two thugs come by, and it's just kind of like, yeah, you two lovebirds, just shut up. We need to go to bed. And before doing so, Bond says, don't worry, I will protect you. However, that's going to be difficult as his cabin is on the other side of where Vivian is, and Vivian is surrounded by the two thugs on either side. However, before turning in for the night, Bond gives Vivian a stubby-nosed Smith & Wesson. It's not something she has a lot of experience with, but it's better than nothing. Well, she tries her best to fall asleep, only to just kind of be plagued with the idea of what are these two thugs going to do. They seem way too willing to just take advantage of me, as if they know they can just get away with whatever they're doing. Well, she wakes up at about 1 o'clock in the morning when she looks over and sees that there is a light coming through. At first she thinks this is just the emergency light, but then she realizes that the thugs turned off the power. It turned out that Horror had a pickaxe that he slowly dug away at the wall so he could come in through the room that way. She attempts to scream, but to no avail. His gigantic hand not only covers her mouth, but also her throat. And all at once, all you just hear is this sickening crack, and she blacked out. When she came to, she only realized that she was being dragged by her feet, and there was just this enormous heat behind her. Well, it turns out that the person dragging her out was nobody else but James Bond, shirtless with nothing but a holster on. And as Vivian comes to, she realizes that the hotel is on fire. James Bond says that this is a very classic ploy. Whenever the motel is not making a lot of money, they torch the place and take care of it for insurance money. And that's very much the case here. And you can tell that these are professionals because instead of using gas, which would leave a trace behind, they're using thermite bombs. That explains that, but Vivian is just like, okay, why are you not wearing a shirt? To which one of the cabins goes up in smoke and says, well, looks like it just got lost in the fire. Essentially, he made a dummy to make it look like that they killed him. And in order to do that properly, he had to have his shirt around the dummy. From there, it's a lot of back and forth intense fighting. When it gets to a point that the pair attempt to get away in their car. However, because of Vivian's shots as well as Bond's shot, the car loses control and careens into the lake. With this out of the way, they go back to one of the available cabins that hadn't been burned down and decide to just enjoy each other's company. First, Vivian wants to take a shower, but then Bond just comes up right behind her and they share a bit of a lathering up. From there, they sleep for a while, when all of a sudden Vivian is awoken one more time to see the hideous, ghostly face of Slugsley peering through the window. This very much reminds me of the Guy Hamilton movies, how it seems like you think everybody is dead, but it seems like one person just escaped for one last battle. He smashes the window and attempts to kill the pair. However, Bond always sleeps on his gun. He is able to do a quick draw and take care of Slugsley with 2 quick shots. The pair is obviously a little shooken up, with Bond just being disappointed that this was the second time they almost nearly killed the pair. He feels like he's losing his killer edge on this sort of thing. Well, after a little bit, they go back to sleep again, and Vivian wakes up to realize that she is alone, and there's just the depression of where Bond was sleeping. He left a note giving a basic rundown of what exactly is going to happen. First, the police are going to come by, and Bond used his contacts in Washington to be able to do them a few extra favors. For instance, these 2 thugs had a price on their head, and Vivian would get all the reward money, as I guess Bond can't accept any awards of any kind. And also the insurance payout for the fraud case as well. And then on top of that, the police also bring Vivian some breakfast, as well as try not to detain her too long before she makes her way around the United States. Before leaving, she has a good talk with one of the police captains. And the main thing he says is, this may seem like a guy in shining armor, but just remember, this guy is a cold-hearted killer. He is made of the same cloth as those two gangsters that got killed last night. It's just he's working for the good guys as opposed to the bad guys. With this piece of advice, Vivian just shuffles it away and makes her way down throughout the United States, and that's where the book ends. Remembering her little fling with the spy who loved me. I could definitely say that reading this book again, the way I am now, I have a very different perspective on it. The first time I read this book, it seemed like during the younger sections where we're going over who Vivian is, they go into some deep, almost nauseating detail about her sexual... It's hard to necessarily say conquests, as she was the one that was being conquered. Sexual encounters, I guess, would make more sense. When I was reading this the first time, I was very disturbed by it, and I just kind of glanced over the pages because I'm just like, no, I don't, this is gross, get it away. But now my thoughts on it have changed a fair bit. The idea of sex is something I don't really find disgusting, but just a natural part of the human condition. It's still not necessarily something I want, but it's not something that makes me physically ill to think about anymore. Of course, I have a whole series of videos explaining as to why, but it's just always interesting if ever you pick up a piece of media and then as you get older you come back to it and you have a very different perspective on it. And a lot of people say that Ian in general is a cookie-cutter case as to what it seems like for a man writing a woman. And honestly, I'm pretty dense when it comes to that stuff, but I very much caught on to it this time reading the book. There's a bit of a line in here where Vivian is just like, yeah, all women like semi-rape. I am sure that is obviously not the case. Consent is a very sexy thing. And on top of that, I'm pretty sure there are some women out there that want to be doing the dominating rather than being dominated. But I'm getting off track. I can definitely say that this first part of the book where we go into Vivian's backstory, it is very dull. It's not until the two gangsters show up that things start to get interesting, but it also gets very frustrating. The whole time I'm just like, no, you can do it, Vivian. Destroy their faces, take out their eyes, do anything. But because Vivian is a woman, she can't stand up to these people, which are men. Then when Bond comes in, that's when it really starts getting good. But it is such a slow burn. So, obviously, this has next to nothing to do with the movie. And from what I hear, this was a bit of a black eye in Ian's, would it be bibliography? In his writings. When Eon Productions were starting to make the James Bond books into movies, he had a clause in his contract that they could use the title The Spy Who Loved Me, but not the story. He felt very much embarrassed by it. And that very much shows with the movie. So, the book Bond is the Spy Who Loved Me. Well, I feel like in the movie, it's more Anya that is the spy that loved James Bond. I could probably go on about what the story is of The Spy Who Loved Me, but you could probably tell that I know this movie inside out at this point. I could probably recite good chunks of it just from my memory. And I've covered the story so many times on this channel that I don't feel like covering it again. But that does lead into one last interesting point. The video game. or the mod of the video game. You may be wondering if the book really had much influence on that. Well, you may notice that the book itself is actually the date book that Aziz Fekesh drops. I thought that was a bit of a fun Easter egg. So in GoldenEye, you had the VHS tape. In Goldfinger, you had the record. Seemed like the book was the next best choice. There was, at one point, an idea of having Vivian Michelle be an extra character. Basically, Bond was to meet a contact on the train, and the contact was originally supposed to be Vivian, just as a nice little nod and a wink. However, for the next level after that, the docks, somebody came up with the brilliant idea of having Coral Jr. be the one to be able to get the player to Sardinia. And it just seemed like one of those things that when you have Coral Jr. involved, you gotta have Felix involved. And that is why Felix is the one on the train. And about the only thing that this book inspired in terms of design would have to be the unfinished hotel level. It was interesting. At this point, there were 19 levels planned out, 2 bonus levels, and there's room for 20 in the game. Well, after reading the book, I'm just kind of like, you know, a gunfight in a hotel. That could be the way to do it. The idea that you would have to rendezvous with Anya after taking care of all the various goons that have surrounded the motel. I don't know. Maybe there's still time to have some sort of Vivian cameo where she'll just be, I don't know, one of the hostages in the hotel room, and Bond will just be like, Vivian? James? It's been a long time. Yes, we've really got to stop meeting like this. Oh, indeed, this has got to be the second hotel you saved me from a gunman from. But, yeah, that's about it for The Spy Who Loved Me. I hope you'll join me next time for the first James Bond book I ever read. On Her Majesties Secret Service. For the first time in paperback. As you could see, this one was in pretty rough shape, but like a lot of things in my life, I picked it up at a thrift store. And hey, it's a unique copy, as I had to kind of reinforce the cover with a whole bunch of post-it notes. And for what it's worth, I feel like I was able to kind of copy over the lettering to be able to see it properly. However, the only problem is this little griffin at the bottom is actually supposed to be holding a gun with both hands. But obviously it's cut off, so you can't see it. Luckily, the back here you're able to mostly read. And just to kind of tell you the idea of how the next book review is going to go. This is not necessarily a hill I will die on, but I will definitely say the movie adaptation of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, I feel like out of all the James Bond movies, this is probably the one that would be deserving of an Oscar. Until next time, keep having fun.